Hello and welcome to the fifth and final webinar organized by the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, eliamep, Medyascope, and the Center for Applied Turkish Studies, the CATS network, supported by the German Federal Foreign Office and Stiftung Mercator. I am Elisa Görge. I will be moderating this webinar. And as a non-resident scholar at eliamep, I had the pleasure to organize this panel with three distinguished speakers on two key aspects in foreign affairs, and especially in Turkish domestic and foreign policy. Those two key aspects are nuclear energy and proliferation. Tackling these issues is important given that next year Turkey is supposed to introduce nuclear power in its energy mix at the same time as we see a lot of developments on the nuclear proliferation front in the region. We're going to cover a very vast territory from Western Asia all the way to East Asia. And without any further ado, I'll briefly introduce our three speakers and then jump right into the questions. Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Rabia Akhtar from the University of Lahore, Dr. Francesca Giovannini from the Harvard Kennedy School, and Dr. Lauren Sukin from the London School of Economics. So I will start with questions for Francesca. Francesca, how would you describe recent developments in the realm of nuclear power in the Middle East? And what impact do you think these developments will have on Turkey's nuclear program? You are muted, I'm afraid, I think.
Here I am. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Elisa, for this wonderful invitation, and to all the participants to this webinar. I want to begin by saying that I just came back from the Amman Security Colloquium in Jordan, and I have to say the nexus between climate change and nuclear energy couldn't be more present. This is also going to be very present at the COP27, now hosted by Cairo, Egypt, and even more so next year, which will actually take place in the United Arab Emirates. Now, I would say that the record of nuclear investments in the region has a sort of mixed bag, in part because of the complexity of the enterprise, the finance that nuclear investments require, the question of human resources, capabilities, the concern over nuclear safety and security, and of course also the international concerns over nuclear non-proliferation. But there is no doubt that nuclear energy has come to the region in full force and has been quite fast in its development. Of course, the three countries that are now leading the way are Iran, and we'll talk about probably proliferation concerns later on, but Iran has a very thriving and very solid civilian nuclear power program with this 40 megawatts heavy water reactor, but he also has enrichment capabilities, a research facility, uranium mining, so it's a very complex, full-scale cycle. The United Arab Emirates has introduced the nuclear power plant, and he has been the very first Gulf country doing so. He has operated the Baraka reactor, and the UAE certainly has the record of showing how a nuclear power plant can be built on time and on budget, therefore prompting more other countries, in follow suit with their investments. And of course, then there is Turkey, as you mentioned, Elisa, which is going to be the third country that will introduce nuclear power in the region, and quite frankly, also bringing nuclear technology in the Mediterranean. But then I think there are other countries that are really making important strides. I mean, we have to remember, for example, Egypt that has just, for example, completed, the first phase of its Daba nuclear power program. And just yesterday, Rosatom actually received a new licensing permit for the second phase of the construction. You also have some other developments that are quite important. For example, Saudi Arabia, in February, DG Grossi, the International Atomic Energy Agency Director General, went to Saudi and very explicitly said that the IAEA now has a thriving technical cooperation for the development of a Saudi nuclear program. And you have very, very recently Morocco signing an agreement with Russia for a potential exploration of nuclear technology, and that Jordan now considering, for example, embracing small nuclear reactors. Now, what does it all mean? It means that nuclear technology is coming to the region. It means that some programs will succeed and others won't, but there will be an enormous pressure at the regional level and the global level to standardize procedures, principles, to bring every country up to speed when it comes to nuclear safety, nuclear security, and nuclear proliferation. And this, in my view, will require a very strong regional approach that unfortunately is not developing yet.
Thank you very much, Francesca. That's very interesting. I will now go to Rabia. So Rabia, could you please describe some of the same developments in the realm of nuclear power, but now in South Asia? And also, do you think they have any bearing on Turkish-Pakistani political and strategic ties? You were just in Turkey, if I'm not mistaken, and you are studying these relations. So have you seen nuclear energy and nuclear power come up a lot?
Thank you so much, Elisa, for having me here. So to talk about Asia, nuclear power is rapidly expanding in Asia. There are almost 114 nuclear power reactors that are currently operational in Asia, and another 30 to 35 that are, either under development or have concrete plans to be built. Pakistan, I'll talk about Pakistan, China, India. And then briefly about your question about Pak-Turkish cooperation, if any, in this realm. So as the operator of numerous nuclear power facilities over the past few decades, Pakistan has had extensive experience. It had previously expressed its desire to work cooperatively with other nations to construct as well as run nuclear power facilities and provide regional nuclear fuel cycle services under the auspices of IAEA. So in an era when global fossil fuel sources are running out, this offer would be helpful for nations turning to nuclear energy to meet their energy needs. The overuse of fossil fuels, particularly by industrialized nations, is also one of the main drivers of climate change, as Francesca rightly mentioned, which has become an existential threat to humanity. And to address this issue, I believe that it is necessary to look into alternative energy sources that are cost-effective, environmentally benign, and sustainable for a great majority of emerging nations. Countries like Pakistan in South Asia, which have little domestic fuel resources, are still very heavily reliant on imports. They are compelled to spend an inordinate amount of their foreign reserves on the purchase of oil each year in order to fulfill their rising energy needs. And the growing price of oil, as you know, on the global market has been put on further strain on Pakistan's economy, making it more open to outside influences. And Pakistan's issues have gotten worse, similar to other countries in the region, through this protracted conflict now between Russia and Ukraine and the continuous, sanctions against Iran. Currently, Pakistan has 6 operational reactors. One is planned, and about 7% of Pakistan's electricity comes from nuclear power. When we look at China, there are 42 planned reactors, 22 under construction, and 54 operational reactors. And China is perhaps the biggest in the market, making rapid progress with construction of new nuclear power reactors. With respect to India, there are 8 reactors under construction, 12 are planned, and 22 are operational. Pakistan has 6 operational reactors and 1 planned. So in the light of Pakistan-Turkish strategic relations, which are defense-oriented in nature, there has been a lot of, disinformation going on and making rounds whenever there is a defense delegation that goes for military-to-military ties. And much of this disinformation in the media comes from India. You can just check up the sources. And there is always an insinuation that Pakistan must be providing nuclear technology or nuclear blueprint to Turkey. When, on the surface of it, there is no such talks that are being held between the two countries. But it is not to say, as an academic, I'd like to speculate that given Pakistan's experience in running nuclear reactors with a great nuclear safety record, Pakistan should, in all sense and purposes, offer help to countries like Turkey that want to embark on this. But for now, no bilateral conversation in this realm is happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. And Lauren, you and I have been doing studies and fielding surveys that deal with Turkish attitudes to both nuclear weapons and nuclear power. And so I wanted to ask you first about nuclear power. What have these surveys revealed about the public opinion in Turkey and how they think, how it thinks about nuclear power? And also, if you can provide us some explanations for why you think people are favorable or not favorable towards nuclear power.
Right. So thank you all. I think this is an important and exciting topic that we're seeing a lot of developments on. So as Liza mentioned, we've been fielding surveys in Turkey and elsewhere, thinking about how the public understands issues around nuclear power and nuclear weapons. In Turkey, we find that 47% of the public think the country should cancel construction of its nuclear power plants. Now, that's a minority of the public, but it is still a substantial number of individuals. And many of these individuals may be concerned because of the strong perceived ties between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. As Rabia mentioned, there's lots of information and concerns about these issues, and repeated studies have shown that people make the association between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, even though there's quite a long chain of developments that has to happen from one to the other. So some of this may be a question of wondering about what comes next, especially in light of other developments in the nuclear field in the region. Nuclear power plants have key benefits, especially in terms of energy security. That's especially relevant, as the others on the panel have mentioned, as the price of oil increases. And they're important as the world learns to adapt to the pressures of climate change. Francesca mentioned that one of the key aspects of effective development in nuclear energy is building plants that are on time and on budget. And unfortunately, Turkey has suffered with these aspects. The current plant, for example, has even had accidents, including a fire, which raised concern among the public and other actors about whether or not it would actually be safe and secure. Now, I think that just emphasizes the importance of continued cooperation around safeguards to make sure that these plants can be opened on time and with the necessary level of security. Now, that's all without talking about the complications raised by the tenuous position of Russia. The US has pressured Turkey, for example, not to try to pursue this additional reactor that Turkey proposed Russia helped build. It would be an additional 4-reactor plant. But Turkey has asked for assistance with that development anyway. And of course, there's the grain deal between Turkey and Russia, which is bringing up many of these concerns about Turkey's geopolitical positioning. Now, the other component of this that I want to briefly talk about is how Turkey sees nuclear energy within its neighbors. So I've mentioned that there's often an association between nuclear power and nuclear energy. And in fact, scholars often think that states that develop nuclear energy may in part be doing so to posture, to suggest that one day, if needed, they could actually develop nuclear weapons. We call this nuclear latency, or sort of a threat that maybe one day you could move from nuclear power to nuclear energy. But it's not that well understood what power latency actually has or where that comes from. And so Eliza and I looked at how individuals in Turkey think about the potential for nuclear power in Greece, a country with whom Turkey shares an alliance, but at the same time has quite a long history of tensions. There we find some mixed views. 33% of individuals in Turkey prefer if Greece doesn't develop any nuclear energy technology, but 46% would support it if Greece did decide to develop these plants, so long as they had non-proliferation commitments attached, like signing the additional protocol. So there is a perception that nuclear energy may be one step down the road towards nuclear weapons, but there are lots of things that we can do to try to stop that pathway, and explicit non-proliferation commitments, as well as cooperation with international institutions, can really help that.
Excellent. Thank you all for dealing and tackling with this important question about nuclear power. We'll now make our way into the proliferation realm. And so I'll go back to Francesca and ask her what the proliferation landscape looks like in the Middle East. I'm here very curious about which countries pose the greatest challenge to stability in the Middle East, and also how they're likely to influence Turkey's own pursuits.
Thank you, Elisa. As you can imagine, this is a very complex question, and I want to go back to what Lauren said very rightly. In my conversations, especially with some of the Arab countries, they really ask me often to say, please, when you talk about the nuclear energy program in the Middle East, clarify that, yes, there could be a connection between proliferation pursuit and nuclear energy, but many of these countries have no intention to. And I think we have to recognize that it is an inalienable right of countries, provided they are in compliance with the NPT, to pursue nuclear energy. So I think it's really important that when we talk about the narrative of these countries, and I agree completely with Rabia, that we are also treating these countries as responsible stakeholders, right? So having said that, there are, in my view, a convergence of factors that do concern me personally. And I see this in particularly in most recent developments. And I talk in particular about these triangulations among Iran, Saudi, and Israel that to me might prove to be quite dangerous for the region beyond actually nuclear proliferation. Now, let me mention a couple of factors that I've noticed in my interaction with the region. I was also in Doha very recently for another weapons of mass destruction free zone discussion. So the very first element that I think we need to notice is that there has been a very clear shift, at least in the last 10 years, a power shift in the region from the more traditional Arab leaders, Egypt, for example, Syria, now completely destroyed by the civil war, Iraq, into the Gulf countries. And this is something that in Harvard we call the Gulf momentum. So if you look at the GDP of these countries, if you look at the economic power, the capabilities that these countries have, this means these countries will be able to scale up their nuclear capabilities, nuclear technology much faster than what we have ever seen in the region or elsewhere in the world. And that makes it a concern, because we could imagine a Saudi program going very fast into developing and acquiring, sensitive capabilities. The second concern for me is that there is a very clear loss of influence from traditional guarantors. I mean, I think the US-Saudi relation has never been at the lowest point as it has been historically. Now, with the election of Netanyahu, we'll see what happens with the midterm elections here in the United States. But the US and Israel has not seen eye to eye on foreign policy for quite some time. There have been frictions also between the United States and Turkey. And so it is clear that this traditional alliance that is supposed somehow to contain also proliferation drivers is actually crippling in. And interference or involvement of other great powers is just inevitable unless the region gives a very strong indigenous response to the concerns that these countries have. The no return to the JCPOA for me is a catastrophe. There is very little doubt that this will have major impact. Now, the JCPOA was also really challenging for the region because in a way it legitimized enrichment capabilities in the region, as the Saudi and many other Gulf countries have pointed out. But no returning to the JCPOA leaves fundamentally in limbo a program that is incredibly sophisticated. Now we are thinking about the possibility for Iran to enrich up to 90%. It'd be very difficult to see what the Israelis, will decide to do now that Netanyahu is coming back to power. And finally, let me also mention that Ukraine has had a very important impact. When I was in the region very recently, one of the main concerns is obviously that the introduction of nuclear power plants in the region makes them a very clear target for potential, hybrid or asymmetric warfare. So in all this, we have to read the introduction of nuclear technology in a region that is destabilizing in terms of power shifts, in terms of global influence. Now, I think something can be done. And again, I go back to countries like Turkey, for example, in countries like, in the Gulf, they could provide the regional leadership that I'm not seeing. This attempt, for example, to revitalize the weapons of mass destruction free zone, despite the rhetoric and the difficulty of reaching that goal, is a very important political process because it brings countries to the table, it allows them to vent and share their concerns and build some kind of trust. So more of these processes are necessary. I think Turkey needs to be in the game, quite frankly. I think Israel needs to be in the game. And right now, the concerns that some of the countries face really need to be tackled on the collective level. So I think might have all this influence, all these factors will have an influence on Turkey's security calculations, no doubt about it, but it will also have serious implications for the great powers relations within the region.
Excellent. Thank you, Francesca. And I'll just add something very quick here. The fact that, for instance, in Turkey, with the nuclear power plants that are built by Rosatom, they don't provide insurance in case of a war. And I think that would happen also in a place like Egypt and anywhere else the Russians are going to sell nuclear power plants. And at the same time, Russia is attacking a nuclear power plant in Ukraine. So the example or the message here, I'm sure, is not lost on those who are planning to buy nuclear power plants from Russia. The next question I have is for Lauren. Going back to the findings in our survey, how does the Turkish public see nuclear weapons? And also, are there any dynamics, any relations between Turkey and other countries that may facilitate or may bring about warmer feelings towards nuclear weapons or actually hostility towards nuclear weapons?
So we also looked in the survey work that Eliza and I have done at how the public thinks about the development of nuclear weapons, potentially in Turkey. The Turkish president has mentioned interest in proliferation at various points, although Turkey does not at the moment have a nuclear weapons program that I am aware of. We asked the public in multiple different ways whether or not they would be willing to support nuclear proliferation if Turkey did decide to go down that route. And between 59% and 73% of the Turkish public answered that they think the country should build nuclear weapons. These numbers are high. They're comparable to what we're seeing in South Korea, where there's been robust discussion for a number of years about the potential of building nuclear weapons or securing forward deployed tactical nuclear weapons from the United States. And Turkey, of course, already has weapons from NATO deployed on their soil, as well as a strong relationship with the NATO alliance. So these numbers should be concerning to us. Why is it the case that individuals in Turkey are so willing at this moment in time to build these very expensive, very destructive weapons? Turkey is situated in a dangerous geopolitical position. It has rivalries within its region. It's also part of the NATO alliance, where we're seeing a resurgence of Russian aggression. And while Turkey has strong relations with Russia, at some moments in time, there are also tensions there. Turkey also has to worry about what will happen as the US continues to act both in this region and elsewhere in the world. And so there are real security concerns that Turkey may be facing, and this could be contributing to this high level of desire for building nuclear weapons. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Turkey's perceptions of other countries and how that might affect these numbers. So one thing we can show in the data that we've collected by looking at Turkish public opinion is that if Greece, for example, signed the additional protocol, support for proliferation in Turkey would decline by 12 percentage points. Now, that's a simple policy that would have a very substantial effect on public opinion. And it does suggest that Turkey is concerned about its neighbors and about its situation within its own region. There's perhaps a perception that proliferation is around the corner, and Turkey may need to be prepared for that. Another area where we see some concern is about whether or not the US is able to act with sufficient restraint. When individuals in Turkey think that the United States is very willing to use nuclear weapons in the NATO context, that increases support for proliferation by about 9 or 10 percentage points. So US behavior in the Mediterranean and Europe, even when that behavior is demonstrating support for American allies and showing American willingness to use nuclear weapons, that is backfiring, and we are seeing support for independence from the US and for greater military capabilities in Turkey as a result. Now, another thing we look at in this survey is to more broadly think about Turkish perceptions of their relationship with the United States. And we find that increased US support for NATO, whether that support goes to Greece or it goes to countries with which Turkey is much more familiar and friendly, like, for example, Hungary, that support can raise concerns about Turkey's own relationship with the US. There's a sense that Turkey is competing with its neighbors to manage the direction of this alliance. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that the US doesn't have any options for shoring up its relationship with Turkey. We do see that when the US supports allies that are far away, where Turkey doesn't have to worry about what happens if a conflict breaks out, it doesn't have to worry about being dragged into those conflicts, like when the US supports Japan or even Taiwan. Then we do see public opinion turn towards the US, and the US is then viewed as more favorable, as a more reliable ally. So the US can communicate to its allies that it's reliable, but this work also tells us the US needs to be able to show that it can restrain its behavior, that nuclear weapons or the use of nuclear weapons is not the main solution to most international security problems. And there are ways to use safeguards and ensure communication to make sure that a world in which nuclear weapons is used is as remote of a possibility as possible.
Thank you very much, Lauren. This is fascinating. I'll very briefly add here the fact that Turkey has the lowest approval of NATO countries, of NATO, at around 9%. So it's usually below 10%, which is fantastically low. And I would also want to add something that responds or engages with what Francesca was saying earlier, which is this kind of doomed if you do, doomed if you don't position that the US is in with regards to its own nuclear weapons, the ones that it has deployed in Turkey. It feels to me that there's a catch-22, and if the US decides to pull these weapons out and to allow, therefore, to pave the way for Turkey to be part of a denuclearized, so nuclear weapons-free zone region in the Middle East, if the US did that, it would provide another incentive for the domestic population, but also the elites in Turkey to say, look, our ally is actually betraying us, it's turning away from us. But at the same time, keeping these weapons on Turkish territory prevents Turkey from engaging in a variety of regional initiatives that would pave the way for more stability and hopefully would curb proliferation. So it's a very, very difficult position to be in, both for Turkey, I would say, and for its NATO allies, especially the US.
I would agree with that. You and I have talked about this before, but the book that I'm writing thinks exactly about this challenge for the US. It has a Goldilocks zone where it needs to show its commitment, but also show that those commitments can be coupled with restraint. So I think this is a really important topic and welcome that addition.
Right, and your work describes this as a backfire effect, if I understood correctly, right? So thank you for that, Lauren. And let me now go back to South Asia and to the nuclear rivalry that exists between Pakistan and India. Rabia, what do you think this protracted conflict, what kind of impact can it have on the Middle East, on Turkey, on the region itself? And do you think there's any role that Turkey can play to help diffuse these tensions, or maybe not diffuse them, but at least alleviate them, reduce them to a certain extent? What's the contribution that a country like Turkey can make to politics and the nuclear contest in South Asia?
Thank you, Liza. It's a very interesting question. So nuclear South Asia is already very fragile, and the situation is quite precarious as it is between India and Pakistan. The competition for new arms and nuclear modernization in the region, is attributed to the strategic change. So whenever Pakistan wants to talk to India about the nuclear situation and restraining each other's nuclear postures, India brings in China factor. And when you look at China is on a modernization spree, and looks at the US factor to be considered for its nuclear modernization. So Pakistan, I say, is at the tail end of the strategic chain. At the beginning of it is US, which influences China's decision making. China's nuclear modernization influences India's decision making and nuclear posturing, and that in turn obviously has an effect on Pakistan. So Pakistan being at tail end doesn't really have much of the momentum to give to strategic change, but absorbs all the shocks that come from top to bottom. With respect to the rivalry, so the latest crisis was obviously had happened in Pulwama Balakot crisis in 2019. And the thing is that whether both countries have learned the same lessons or not, the situation in Pulwama Balakot was pretty serious. We almost reached to the second round of escalation, but then crisis termination, and I've written about it, rested squarely with Pakistan as to how it reciprocated and the proportionality of its response and the release of the Indian pilot, all of that, and the decision making that was done during crisis by the leadership of that time. I think all of that contributed to not taking the crisis to the second level of escalation. But that cannot be true for a future crisis to come. So what lessons both India and Pakistan draw is incredibly important. For a country like Turkey, President Erdogan in UNGA speeches have been making a special mention of Kashmir. He has, raised this issue with both India and Pakistan, saying that, you should resort to UNSC resolutions and find a solution for this Kashmir conflict. But to be really honest, while Pakistan has approached and has been approached by various countries and has always welcomed the third party mediation in the Kashmir crisis, it has been India's principal stance that it is a bilateral issue and they just lock out every other third party to negotiate. So while Turkey is doing a great balancing act between Russia and Ukraine and is managing its alliances, I really doubt that it has a very strong role to play between the India-Pakistan crisis. So what Pakistan is grateful for is President Erdogan making the statement and raising the issue and keeping the issue alive and pushing both countries to seek resolutions. The strategic stability in the region is very, very fragile because there are still pockets where crisis can erupt, and any crisis has the potential of leading to war, which can be raised to the nuclear threat levels. So that's how I see the situation.
Thank you very much, Rabia. Much appreciated. I remember being in Pakistan at your kind invitation some years ago and going through a museum where Pakistan highlighted its most important allies. And so we had China, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. Those were the three countries that featured very prominently in this exhibit. The US was not there. And it was a sign to me. I didn't know much at that point about these relations, but these strategic ties are growing and they are very important. And that's where my question came from. I wonder if in the future, as bilateral ties intensify, if Turkey would be able to play a role like the role it's playing in Ukraine, in the war in Ukraine. But you're absolutely right. It's in a way kind of still far away or far enough that and these escalatory dynamics are so easy to flare up locally that it's I would imagine very difficult for another party to come in and really make a difference. So thank you so much for that, Rabia. I will now go back to Francesca and link to one of the things that Lauren mentioned earlier, which is the fact that President Erdogan complained in 2019 that the NPT is a discriminatory treaty. His statement that Turkey will not accept a situation where some countries are allowed to have nuclear weapons while others are not. His statement triggered comments that actually Turkey might be interested in acquiring nuclear weapons. And so I'm curious to know what you make of these statements. And also, if you have any thoughts, if you could share with us your thoughts about how the non-proliferation regime can be strengthened to address this criticism, maybe referring to some of your own work in international organizations, but also in less formal settings that would prompt a strengthening of this regime.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elisa. I think this is a really important question. To the statement of President Erdogan, I think this was both a hedging strategy, right? Is keeping the alert, the interest, the attention, up. I've always said to many of my colleagues around the world that, a nuclear latent country might actually be more powerful than nuclear weapon state because the latency is what draws incentives and engagement and various things. So that could be an edging strategy, but there is no doubt that President Erdogan captures also what the opinion of many countries around the world is and remains, which is the NPT is de facto introducing two classes of states. And that was the same reason why India never decided to join the NPT, although they were really very active in the negotiations. But also France, for example, didn't join until 1992, precisely for the same reason, and Brazil. So I think this captured really the problem that we have at the very core of the relation between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. We have a fundamental regime that is unable to disarm one, and quite frankly also is kind of weakening on the latter side in trying to prevent what potentially could be proliferation risks down the line. So how do we rebalance this? I think you said it very, very correctly, and it's also my thinking. I don't think any change will come from hard institutions or multilateral institutions. You have seen this particularly with the Ukraine war. The politicization of even technical organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency. I mean, very recently, for the first time, the General Assembly couldn't even pass a resolution via Vienna consensus because the Ukraine war became such an important topic. The NPT didn't reach a final conclusion, a final resolution because of the Ukraine war. So the politicization, in my view, in the international organizations is here to stay for several decades. So we really have to think about informal mechanisms or dialogue settings where we can actually bring together on interest base, countries that want to work together on specific issues. Let me give you the example that in the region, which I found to be one of the most promising one, which is really the regional emergency preparedness concerns. Something you mentioned, Elisa, which I think goes at the core of this issue. As the region prepares to enter into this nuclear age, now, of course, the concerns about safety and security, but also the potential fact that their critical infrastructures might become a target of military attacks or cyber attacks becomes really an important issue. So I've seen many countries, really improbable collaborators, being willing to sit down together to think about regional emergency preparedness and what happens in the case of a nuclear accident, which is a transnational, event in and of itself. But let me also mention that I think there are other things that we need to do, and we need to do seriously. I wrote very recently about a new generation of negative security assurances. For me, there is no longer the case. We cannot continue with this platitude of promises and vague statements that we make to non-nuclear weapon states, that we will not attack them, that this is no longer, viable. What the Ukraine war has shown, in my view, is not necessarily that we don't know how to do nuclear deterrence, is that we don't know how to protect non-nuclear weapon states from nuclear blackmailing and nuclear coercion. And so in that case, what is the collective defense mechanism that we can apply? Let me also mention that, a case I've looked at now recently is the fact that Ukraine never actually called for Article 51, Chapter 7 of the UN. And when I asked some of my Ukrainian colleagues why wasn't the case, right? The Ukrainians told me because even if we had invoked him, nobody would have come. So what does it tell you about the collective defense system? So it is in the interest of the nuclear weapon states to really give guarantees to non-nuclear weapon states that nuclear weapons is not the way to go. Otherwise, we will end up in a situation with plenty of nuclear latency crises and really big instability around the world. Let me just finish by saying, I have looked and tracked some of the institutional discussions that are happening in the region. I find it really interesting that there are a lot of informal dialogues going on. There is a Saudi-Iran dialogue taking place in Jordan. There is a Baghdad dialogue over the Yemen war. These are, in my view, really important and encouraging platforms. These are dialogues. They're not treaties. They're not agreements. But if we are able in a way to create a front-end nuclear dialogue in the region, not when nuclear latency has already occurred, but when actually you have just the emerging of these nuclear energy programs, there is a lot of space for negotiations of standards and principles that can really bring some predictability to the region and to the world. And I think in that sense, the region could lead towards a front-end nuclear energy dialogue, which might resemble a little bit the format of the Euratom system in the European Union. So there are models that the region can use. It can really also help boost, quite frankly, the nuclear non-proliferation regime.
Thank you so much, Francesca. I'm sure we'll get some other questions on this from the public, from those who are listening to us later on. If not, I have actually a couple of follow-up questions. But now I'll go to Rabia and ask her about kind of the same topic of non-proliferation. So Pakistan and India, as mentioned already, have not signed or ratified the NPT. They also have not yet secured membership in the Nuclear Suppliers Group. The Nuclear Suppliers Group being one of the effective ways in which transfers of technology have been regulated, and especially on the sensitive front, so enrichment and reprocessing, those kind of technologies have been have not been allowed to be passed on to other countries. So India and Pakistan both have those kind of technologies, both want to join the NSG, but have not been allowed to do so. So I'm curious what you think the impact of their exclusion is on relations with Turkey, but also more broadly on the non-proliferation regime.
Thank you, Lisa. I think, if you're really serious about non-proliferation, then, gatekeeping entry of countries that you're most worried about is not the best way to go about it. Pakistan has expressed its concerns to possible Indian membership into NSG. And I also have an issue with instruments like TPNW. So, it is like the naughtiest kids in the class are not, part of the class, and then you've given the monitorship to somebody who's been decent all their lives and never committed any, it has not been problematic, right? So what use that room full of good people is when all the naughty kids are outside it. So similarly in NSG, after the Indo-US nuclear deal, and also the increasing strategic alliance between United States and India, Pakistan has raised this concern that giving India NSG membership while you keep Pakistan out of it is not going to help. And I believe that if the world is really worried about Pakistan's proliferation credentials, then it should let Pakistan into NSG, because that is going to have some serious non-proliferation conditions attached to Pakistan's entry, right? And, all those concerns should be addressed once Pakistan gets that membership. In that respect, Pakistan's two allies, China and Turkey, in the NSG have really been supportive of Pakistan's cause, but on two different angles, which is really fascinating, because China, on the one hand, has been blocking India's entry into NSG by saying that there should be a criteria-based entry into NSG. So develop that one criteria, and then judge both India and Pakistan on it and let them enter the NSG. So you should not admit India. If India meets that criteria, then judge Pakistan on that criteria as well. Whereas Turkey, which I was pleasantly surprised, has been supporting Pakistan's non-proliferation credentials, and has been saying that Pakistan and India should be given simultaneous entry into NSG. And does not talk about a criteria-based membership, and actually makes the case for Pakistan that NSG, given Pakistan's extensive, contribution and experience in the area of, nuclear safety and operating nuclear reactors for so long, Pakistan's membership in the NSG will actually contribute to global non-proliferation objectives. And Pakistan is obviously, as a state, really grateful to both China and Turkey for supporting its entrance into NSG if that ever happens. So overall, I believe that if non-proliferation is truly your objective, the world's objective, then I think both India and Pakistan should be given simultaneous entry into NSG, and not one just because the leadership of NSG has a strategic alliance with one country and wants to prop it up and give it favors. So that will be discriminatory. So that's how I look at both Turkish and Chinese support for Pakistan's NSG membership.
Thank you, Rabia. I'll jump in for 30 seconds here as well. So in my book, I'm talking about the history of the NSG and how it came about, membership, who joined, why, and how. And indeed, the criteria was having an interest in nuclear power, which is sort of, one of the most basic common denominators that you have with countries like India and Pakistan. And actually, it was very interesting to see in these documents that Pakistan was considered in the 1980s, well, say late 70s and 80s, for membership in the NSG alongside India. And that was, of course, before the revelations of what the AQCON network had done with countries like Libya and North Korea and so on, and Iran. So it was, it's interesting to see how requirements for memberships in some of these key organizations, they kind of change over time. And the rules are made by those who are in privileged positions, the founders, the most powerful. And I agree with you that if we really want to promote non-proliferation, then what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I think that's the expression, right? All right. So the last question that I have prepared for our discussion today takes me back to Lauren and to this conundrum of addressing the need for electricity production, for lowering emissions, decarbonizing, but dampening the desire or the ability actually to get nuclear weapons. So how can we reconcile these two goals? How can we encourage the development of nuclear power, but not at the same time let out the genie from the nuclear bottle?
So I'll try to keep my comments here short so we can get to some questions, but also because I really agree with much of what Francesca has said about strengthening the non-proliferation regime. I would say the key components are to work on ways to protect states from nuclear blackmail, from these emerging ways in which nuclear weapons are still being used to shape global politics, and that the answer to that can no longer really be our traditional interpretation of nuclear deterrence. It's now a question of finding conventional solutions to nuclear problems, of strengthening alliances in many different ways, and of taking things like security assurances and making sure that they incorporate consultations, that they involve multiple stakeholders, that they create crisis negotiation mechanisms, and are adaptive to the threats that we really see today. Dampening Turkey's desire or need for nuclear weapons, I think, also means continuing some of the more traditional non-proliferation policies, making it clear that states that do seek nuclear weapons will face consequences for doing so, strengthening the ability to use sanctions to try to resolve these threats should they happen. But at the same time, we need to recognize that, as I've said before, nuclear weapons are separate from nuclear energy, and Turkey very much has a strong rationale to achieve energy security, to deal with the pressing threats related to climate change. And nuclear power is a way to do that. Whatever cooperation can be mustered to make sure that these power plants can be developed safely and securely, that the domestic infrastructure to maintain them can be developed in accordance with recommendations of the IAEA and the international community, I think that's the best path forward. The piece to this that I do want to add from the research that Eliza and I have been doing is we looked a little bit at what the public thinks the role of nuclear energy is in Turkey. What are the things that would substitute for nuclear energy if Turkey stopped developing it, for example? And we find that 68% of the Turkish public would see renewables as the best substitute for nuclear energy. And I think this emphasizes for us that the purpose of nuclear power plants is to achieve energy security and move away from fossil fuels, if that's possible. And this is one way to do it. At the same time, those energy needs are pressing. About half of the Turkish public would accept fossil fuel developments instead of nuclear energy plants if that trade-off were needed. Again, emphasizing the importance of nuclear energy. But perhaps of concern to us as well is that strong majorities of the public also think that military programs would help substitute for nuclear power. That if Turkey didn't have nuclear power, there would be higher levels of support for investment in both offensive and defensive military technology. And so even though there is this desire for nuclear power plants for reasons related to energy, there is also this very strong connection between, at least in the mind of the public, between nuclear energy and military security. And so any of these policies can't happen on their own. It requires a package of policies that combines traditional non-proliferation attempts, strengthened ways to ensure security, both regionally and broader security around the role of nuclear weapons and nuclear threats in the world. And it requires a path forward with respect to energy security.
Thank you. Fascinating, Lauren. Thank you, Rabia, Francesca, Lauren, for this very interesting conversation. We still have a few minutes to go. And so I'll open it up to questions from our audience. I believe those comments will come to me in chat. And I don't see anything at the moment here, which makes me think about and bring up a couple of questions of my own while we're waiting for the public. So I'm not gonna open it up to a specific person. This is whoever wants to tackle this question is free to do so. I kindly ask you to do so. What would you think is the prospect of the TPNW becoming the law of the land in Turkey, the region, and more broadly in Asia? I know this is, I mean, I can see you smiling because I'm talking about sort of fairy tales here, but if you can indulge and tell us a bit more about this treaty and how you think it's likely to impact regional dynamics in Asia, but also Turkey's own trajectory, that would be great.
So Eliza, I've already given you my peace of mind about TPNW, so I would like to hear what Francesca and Lauren have to say about it.
Sure.
So I'll just...
Sorry. Lauren. No, go.
I'll just say the reason Eliza says maybe this is a fantasy is because no state that has nuclear weapons has signed the TPNW or the Nuclear Ban Treaty. And we could look at that and say, well, that means there's very little the treaty can do. On the other hand, the treaty does represent a clear statement by a large number of states that don't have nuclear weapons that the current nuclear international order isn't sustainable, and that progress needs to be made on issues of denuclearization, arms control, and other measures to try to ensure nuclear safety and security. So while there are challenges to the implementation of the law, it does have, I think, an important symbolic role. And it is possible that if this continues to develop, then maybe we'll see Turkey have an opportunity to be a participatory in this process. But I'll let Francesca say more. I think she's maybe more familiar with this issue.
Well, thank you. I have two concerns about this. The very first one is that it's very important that non-nuclear weapon states understand what TPNW or other forms like the weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East are supposed to do and what they are not going to be able to do. Like, there is a lot of frustration in the Middle East and in the Gulf about WMD free zone. But the problem is the expectations that this countries pose on these treaties. The weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East will not be able to disarm Israel. The TPNW is not going to be able to disarm nuclear weapon states. You can't disarm something you don't have. So you need to be clear about why you accede to these treaties and why you are doing it. And I think it's perfectly legitimate for non-nuclear weapon states to commit to each other, to establish a trust relation among each other in saying we will never pursue nuclear weapons. But it's very important that we understand what these treaties are supposed to do. And the frustration around the weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, in my view, has resulted from wrong narrative. This has never been a disarmament treaty for Israel. This has been a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the region for countries that want to accede and don't have nuclear weapons. So my concern about introducing all these institutions and these regimes is that it creates a sense of expectations that are then constantly frustrated. And that, in my view, increases the grievances. So the way to go, in my view, is not so much about, exactly like Rabia said, to create communities among countries that are already committing to nuclear non-proliferation, to nuclear disarmament, but is creating new avenues for nuclear weapon states, non-nuclear weapon states, to exchange views, to build trust, and to move along together. The TPNW doesn't do this. And to me, that creates, again, a discrepancy that then needs to be repaired in some ways.
Excellent. Thank you all for engaging with this question. I was told that we do have questions in the chat on YouTube. So I'm now taking a question from Nafisa Aga, a student at Bilkent University. She would like to pose a question to Dr. Akhtar. So she wants to know if Pakistan is allowed to, under the auspices of the NPT regime, sell its nuclear technology, sell its nuclear energy resources for economic gain without the threat of sanctions.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question, Nafisa. So firstly, Pakistan is not part of the NPT regime, has not signed the NPT, so obviously is not bound by those laws. But in order to do nuclear commerce in the broader non-proliferation regime, you need to be a member of the NSG. And that's where Pakistan is striving to get into the legal framework based on its track record of safety and security procedures that it has maintained on its nuclear reactors, and has gained enough experience that it is ready for that nuclear energy commerce and wants entry into the NSG. On another, just very briefly on the other side, I believe that the nuclear security summits had given a great platform for countries to exchange best practices, and that doesn't require to be a part of NPT or NSG or any other forum. So I've written this elsewhere as well, that probably Pakistan, India, China, they can come together and have a trilateral nuclear security summit where they exchange best practices. And that goes for Turkey too. As Turkey enters into, and has its nuclear reactor operational by next year, I think nothing stops Pakistan and Turkey to exchange best practices. And Pakistan has a nuclear center of excellence which is endorsed by IAEA for such purposes. And I would believe that Pakistan should open it up to Turkish officials from the nuclear energy sector and scientists, and bring them over and train them and talk to them about the best practices that have given Pakistan this stellar record in the nuclear energy domain over a period of years. So that is one thing that Pakistan can do and should think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia, and thank you, Nafisa. Very quickly, a question for Dr. Sukin from Widi Susanto. Dr. Sukin, when considering perceptions of U.S. behavior, is there a view of U.S. decline contributing to a view of procuring nuclear weapons? Do such views exist in the Far East, like in the South Korea, Japan context?
I wouldn't say decline necessarily, but I do think that there are concerns about maybe shifting U.S. priorities and how the U.S. is going to respond as the world seems to get more dangerous. In Turkey, we do see some maybe minimal evidence of this concern. A few of the respondents in our survey did write saying that they weren't sure what the U.S. would look like, or if the U.S. would be reliable given the challenges of particularly the previous U.S. administration. That being said, I think a lot of these issues really come down to whether or not the US can be a reliable ally. And as we mentioned, that means that the US is stuck between a rock and a hard place. It needs to be able to make sure that it can maintain its commitments and not be overstretched, but also has to make clear what the boundaries of those commitments are.
Very important point. Thank you very much, Lauren. And a question from Maria Belitz about the authoritarian nature of certain regimes. So how important do you find the public opinion in the formation of policy and the changing of security priorities in Turkey, specifically nuclear? So in a country that has been described as competitive authoritarianism, according to some of my colleagues, Berg Esen especially, do we think public opinion matters? I guess that's more for you, Lauren, since, but also feel free, for Rabia and Francesca, if you want to jump in with remarks about this for other contexts, other countries where public opinion, we're wondering if it matters in a country like Pakistan or in a country like Iran or Saudi Arabia. So I'll open it up for all three of you.
I'll say that the role of the public is going to look different in different countries. Of course, countries that are generally more responsive to their publics, that are more democratic, leaders may be more constrained by those choices. Part of the reason why we think it's important to understand what the public wants, even in countries that maybe are less receptive to public attitudes, is because we would think of the public often as being a constraint on really aggressive or unusual policies. Would be very difficult for a leader to, for example, develop a nuclear weapons program if the public was strongly opposed. And we can think about the history of anti-nuclear attitudes in Germany and Japan, for example, as very powerful constraints on the nuclear policy-making decisions in those states. But in places where the public is receptive to, or in some cases even actively advocating for nuclear proliferation, as we're seeing in South Korea and maybe we'll see in Turkey, given the numbers that Eliza and I find there, then the public can actually push governments in the other direction. So no, public opinion doesn't translate one for one into the decision makers that elites make, but it does still shape the options that decision makers have. And so understanding those pressures is critical to being able to understand where policy might go.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lauren. Rabia, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so briefly, I want to give a shout out to a project that we're doing with BASIC on nuclear responsibilities. And I think this is the first time I was fascinated by your research with Lauren and references to it. Nothing of this sort has happened in Pakistan. We don't have public opinion on nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. And I think, frankly, we've crossed that bridge. But with the Nuclear Responsibilities Project, we are engaging and starting a discourse in Pakistan about what Pakistan's nuclear responsibilities entail. And it is Pakistan's nuclear responsibilities as a nuclear weapon state to its citizens and to the countries in the region, and also to the countries beyond the region. So that is where some sort of conversation can begin to take shape. But like I said, we are beyond public opinion influencing any policy. This was the first time, that government had even involved academics into foreign policy processes, making academics part of an advisory group that was set up 2 years back. But nothing of that sort ever happens in Pakistan. It's a closed door elite conversation in Pakistan. And I think that with our Nuclear Responsibilities Project, we're going to take this conversation forward and engage public as to what nuclear responsibility, both in the civilian nuclear energy domain and also the nuclear weapons domain, should look like in Pakistan. So let's hope for the best.
Absolutely.
Lauren,
Best of luck, Rabia.
Elisa, could I add a couple of comments here? So I find this question about how public opinion matter in democracies and authoritarian regimes really important. And I want to share my experience in the Gulf in particular, and bizarrely also in North Korea. Actually, I just finished a paper on nuclear safety. So authoritarian regimes, if one look at their narrative, especially in contemporary times, there is a narrative that I would call techno-nationalism, right? So where these countries try to cast themselves at the front line of technological innovation. You've seen Saudi with the NEOM project, this hyper city of the future. But you've also seen, for example, North Korea, talking about this techno prestige of the regime when it comes to their nuclear program. What I found is, so in those countries, the nuclear safety concerns are particularly important because the entire basis of their national prestige and this idea of this techno nationalism is really based on the ability of the regime to manage these very sophisticated technological programs in a rather successful way. And so I find this an area, a niche, where the public opinion really matters in making these countries more responsible in the way in which they approach, for example, nuclear risks. And I've seen this in my own work on North Korea, where you actually would think that they wouldn't necessarily care very much about nuclear safety, but it's actually not. It's quite the opposite. They did care about nuclear safety because the program is so important for the national and international prestige that they feel responsible to their own people and to the world, a thriving program. In that sense, I think there is a way to influence the policies also in very authoritarian regimes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Francesca and Rabia and Lauren. I think Lauren is having some technical issues. Hopefully she will join us momentarily. I'll briefly add here that the whole point why public opinion is supposed to influence policymakers is because of audience costs, and others have shown in the past that audience costs can come from a variety of sources, including from within the elite circles, but maybe it's the military, maybe it's actually members of the same party, if you have a dominant party system or a one-party system. So being accountable is, of course, something that democracies, or holding policymakers responsible and accountable, is something that democracies do better than autocracies. But that's not to say, as all of you here have mentioned, that autocracies can simply do everything they want to and never have to listen to anyone. I mean, it's never one single person that can run a whole country. So this has been very, very interesting. We are coming on to the 7:15 my time mark. And I don't seem to find any other questions on YouTube. A lot of people actually would like us to tell them where where they can see the results of our study on Turkey and nuclear weapons. And hopefully we'll share those, we'll be able to share those soon. I was curious about something that maybe hopefully both of you would like to engage with, and that's this whole notion that Professor Mustafa Kibarolu, a very prominent scholar of nuclear proliferation in Turkey at MEF University, has put forward in his own work, which is the domino effect that we are likely to see when one country goes nuclear, others will follow. And of course, that by going nuclear here, I mean obtaining nuclear weapons. So we've seen that in South Asia. We can trace actually how after China gets the bomb, India is prompted to do the same, of course, 10 years later, and then Pakistan gets the bomb. So it seems like to a certain extent this logic does operate to a certain degree in South Asia. And in the Middle East, various scholars and policymakers have argued that, well, if Iran goes nuclear, then Turkey will go nuclear, and then Egypt will go nuclear, and so on. What do you make of this argument? Do you think it's oversimplistic, or do you think it actually reflects something that we are likely, or we could see in the future in the region?
I think there is some sense in this dominoes theory. I believe that Iran already is a threshold state, and it is just a question of taking a political decision to exit the NPT, using its right under Article 10. But when it does the pros and cons of leaving Article 10, I think that's where they hesitate. And also JCPOA, the credibility that United States had built has been razed to the ground when US left that. So if Iran does go nuclear, then obviously, we would see, Saudi Arabia already, making that case for Saudi Arabia's own security, and Turkey, might follow suit. But these are oversimplistic statements. It's just like it's easier for us to just sit and say, but if you actually do a pros and cons or cost benefit analysis, there are more costs to these countries going nuclear than the benefit that they might accrue, because they might be isolated and have more sanctions on them than they already have. And it is not good for regional security and stability. Same cases go for South Korea and Japan, which have very high-end, nuclear energy programs, but are, doing the cost-benefit analysis. So while there is some, soul to this argument, I seriously believe that it would be much harder. Otherwise, it would have already happened. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia.
For me, so I completely agree with Rabia. I tell you what concerns me about this theory of domino effect. Now, this has been partly historically grounded, right? If you look at Iraq, Syria, Libya, I mean, the idea was, especially at the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, there was this sort of outbreak of nuclear proliferation between Iran, Iraq, Libya, and so on and so forth. I think more than actual nuclear proliferation, what concerns me is that you might have a domino effect when it comes to sensitive technologies. I think the enrichment capabilities is the big price. And what the JCPOA has done, for good or bad, has legitimized the entrance of enrichment capabilities in the region. So you might see, and you're already seeing, a domino effect with the Saudi Arabia. You mentioned, Rabia, right? The refusal of Saudi to sign the 123 agreement with the United States. Jordan has refused to. And so the idea is you might end up having a nuclear latency domino effect, which has a very powerful hedging strategy, because you don't know whether you can apply sanctions to a country that is just building some capabilities, but at the same time, you also have a very clear proliferation problem when it comes to missiles in the region. 13 countries have very thriving missile programs right now. So you might be in a very difficult situation where nuclear latency is not enough to apply sanctions or for counter-proliferation operations, but at the same time, these countries might pose significant risks. That is what really, in my view, might happen. I don't see this outbreak exactly like Rabia said. Look, acquiring nuclear weapons is a very difficult process, a very long process. If you have to do it indigenously, it will take years. And it's very difficult for, today to really be able to hide the capabilities that you have with the satellite technologies and so on and so forth. But nuclear latency can be really open air, and it might actually generate some hedging strategies and a lot of uncertainty. That is the part of the theory that I really buy into.
Just one thing I would like to draw your attention and the audience's attention is about CTBT. Lately we have just heard reports coming from India that they might consider a nuclear test, and if they do, they've already preempted by making the statements that.
Rabia? I think we lost Rabia as well. I hope she comes back. But it's a very important point. And Francesca, you used to work for the CTBTO, and I saw you shaking your head when Rabia mentioned the announcement from India. I don't suppose that you can finish what she was starting to say, but if you want to add anything to this idea and share your experience of the CTBTO with us, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, to be honest, this is also very concerning. We've for years we've taken for granted this moratorium on nuclear testing. Now there is a moratorium in South Asia between India and Pakistan, which is a bilateral moratorium, but all nuclear weapon states, with the exception of North Korea, have actually embraced the moratorium after 1996. And my 2 years at CTBTO, I have to tell you, Elisa, more than once we've talked about one of these countries going back to nuclear testing. There have been allegations, if you remember, the United States accusing the Russians of conducting secret nuclear weapons testing at Novaya Zemlya. There has been a report where the United States also accused China of conducting secret nuclear weapons tests. So this is also crippling. I mean, it's very obvious, right? When you introduce modernization and potential also new designs of nuclear weapons, the need for testing becomes almost, impossible to resist. In that sense, I do agree in the domino theory. I think once you break the moratorium on nuclear testing, it will be very difficult for other countries not to follow suit. That is a norm that, in my view, once is broken, it will be almost impossible to repair. And so if that's the case, we are expecting another North Korea test, which, North Korea has not tested since 2017. This is going to be also a major, groundbreaking moment. So I think also the nuclear testing norm is in danger right now. And the CTBTO staff, I can tell you, they're actually really very concerned about this.
Thank you very much, Francesca. I just got an email from Rabia telling us that she lost power. And given the energy crisis that we sort of began with, this is unfortunate, but at the same time, not entirely surprising. And hopefully this will not be something that we will experience at all over the course of this long winter ahead of us. I don't want to end on such a gloomy note, but I do want to thank our distinguished panelists for today, Francesca Giovannini, Lauren Sukin, and Rabia Akhtar, for a very interesting, engaging, and insightful conversation on a very important topic in regional affairs in the Middle East, Western Asia, and for Turkey especially. Many thanks to the organizers, to eliamep for hosting us, Medyascope as well, and to the funders of this project. We hope this is going to be shared with as wide of an audience as possible, and we look forward to receiving more comments on this in the future, and also to seeing any of the projects and publications that were mentioned today in this webinar in print, and looking forward to engaging with the three of you, the two who are in spirit with us, and with Francesca in the future. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.